Yeah, we are glad to welcome Dr. Lonesh from Maulana Azad Medical College. We've been looking at various aspects of the gas insufflation-less laparoscopic surgeries. And as you're aware, most of the audience is from rural areas. And today's topic is more of a theory class because it's more to do with the advantages of the gasless procedures, the various physiological changes that occur with the gasless procedures and so on. If you have any doubt, please type in the chat box. We'll be happy to answer those doubts and clarification at the end. And we're glad to welcome Dr. Lonesh, and he can take over now. Good evening.
Hello everyone, good evening. I hope I am audible to everyone. Dr. Nanda, is it okay?
Good evening, sir. Loud and clear.
Oh, brilliant. Can I see the people who have joined in? Is it? Okay, I'm getting some video. Yes. Hi, good evening everyone. Myself, Dr. Lavneesh Bench. I'm an associate professor in the Maulana Azad Medical College. So perhaps last week, one of my colleagues, Dr. Anurag, had one session. So this time he was busy, I joined in. So I bring greetings from Maulana Azad Medical College. This is my institute, and this is my institute at the so-called night time. And I shall be talking about laparoscopic access. Now, what I will be talking about, we will be talking of all access techniques, and I leave it to you to understand which one is a better technique. Of course, definitely we will talk about in detail about our Gill's technique. Then we will have a session on pathophysiology of pneumoperitoneum, where you will understand that when we put gas inside the abdominal cavity, how much deleterious or harmful effects are there. Now, these effects are obviously not when we are not using any kind of a gas with a Gill's device. So, laparoscopy, as per general terms, as everyone is aware, the literal meaning is laparize the abdomen. Scoping is to examine. Everybody must agree with me for the last 3 decades now. This minimal access surgery has been on the rise. What we started with only some kind of a diagnostic scopies and diagnostic laparoscopies, we have moved out to one of the highest pillars or one of the highest, you can say, peaks that we have started doing with minimal access techniques, that laparoscopic liver resections and even Whipple's, which is one of the benchmark highest surgery. Now it has become, obviously I believe everybody is aware how much advantages laparoscopy or minimal access techniques has, that there are small scars, patient has early recovery, early return to work, and the pioneer work of Dr. Nandaj, it was very happy and astonished to see the pioneer work he has been doing in the rural parts of the country. I belong to an urban center. My center is so-called a tertiary care center. Dr. Ganraj is already performing in those areas where we believe that majority of our population is daily working. Many of them are farmers, many of them are workers, poultry farm workers. I believe that minimal access has more advantages to this population, so they can early resume their activities. So when we are talking of access, and this is going to be comprehensive talk, I will be talking of all essentially closed technique and open technique. So when we talk of a laparoscopic surgery, the access is one of the first steps. It still remains one of the key challenges how to gain access into the cavity. And it is one of the foremost skills. That means when you have to start a laparoscopy or minimal access, the surgeon should be having enough skills to get inside the abdomen first and then perform the surgery. And to it I will add, it has been almost, it started with somewhere from 1970s when diagnostic scopies were started, from early 80s and 1990s that cholecystectomy started. So it has been, say, from 94 or 95 to 2020, that is this year, almost 25 years. Believe it or not, the complication rate has nearly remained the same of whatever technique I'm going to talk about. So one thing is when we have to do a laparoscopy, we essentially look for a point which is central because we want to put our instrument in, our telescope in, and have to view the entire abdomen. The natural choice for a central point becomes as a navel or the umbilicus. Now, why the umbilicus is so called the central point and why it is the most preferred point? There are many other points, but why umbilicus remains one of the preferred points? It's a natural scar, natural depressed scar, which is 1.5 to 2. And this is a classical infundibular shape, that is, this is the skin and there is a decussation of linea alba, the fibers here. This is known as an infundibular shape. The key advantages of this position are abdominal wall is thinnest in this position because whatever it is a scar, it is a cicatrix. It is bound to be some kind of fibrosis, but it is the thinnest area. You don't find any blood vessels here unless it is portal hypertension. It is linea alba, that is a decussation of anterior sheath. There are no actual muscles here. Obviously, linea alba is around 2 centimeters. When we start moving more laterally, you will find muscles. And important thing, the peritoneum here is mostly fused. You have seen the last video which sir was playing that we put our knife and whenever we put our hemostat or RT forceps to bluntly dissect the peritoneum, we are directly in because the peritoneum is fused. Unless you do laparotomy apart from umbilicus, whichever side it's easy to distinguish the peritoneum. This may not be case at umbilicus. So these are advantages that we will think of minimal access, we look for a central point and obvious choice remains umbilicus. So the umbilicus remains a primary site. There are many other sites and most of these sites which were mentioned in the book were on the lateral border of rectus muscle, the X sites. Of course, there are many other sites many people have done by their name, but these remains the essential primary sites. To choose which should be the site of excess, the first thing is we should evaluate the patient for any possibility of adhesions. That is, take a proper history regarding what surgery was done, what were the findings, whether it was an infective pathology where I expect inflammation was perhaps more, or it was something else. History of peritonitis, there could have been no scar, but there could have been a history of spontaneous peritonitis. That's again, you will find the thickening or fusion, or there can be some kind of adhesions. Abdominal scar, where they are oriented. It is not that this particular case cannot go under laparoscopy, but if you are aware of the scars, you tend to be in a virgin area that will, for this, if you want to do it laparoscopically for some reason, you have to be away somewhere here. Then is your umbilical anatomy. Have a look. You can have a small hernia. You can have a deep pit. You can have a vertical orientation. You may have a slit-like vertical orientation, a flat but with a horizontal scar, or some kind of a everted or flat. Now the obvious reason is umbilical hernia will have to be repaired anatomically whenever you're doing. You can definitely go through this area, but repair is a must when you attempt a closure, and that of course non-mesh repair. And whatever the scars are there, you tend to orient your incision accordingly. If I tend to make a horizontal incision, I am perhaps giving some kind of a more scar. Here my incision will be essentially vertical, and this particular image, this can be horizontal. This can be either vertical, either horizontal, either can be transumbilical. This can be also transumbilical. So umbilical anatomy, that means how much amount of cross-message you want to give to a particular patient will depend upon it. Distribution of abdominal wall, that is how much person is obese. Usually we don't find in our rural setup, most of the population of the working. That is why when we do GILS, we do patients up to maybe around 30 BMI. Or when you do something as a standard, maybe for other practices, just for your information, this is an important concern. If you see what has happened in this, from xiphisternum to umbilicus, and if I'm planning an upper abdominal surgery and choose umbilicus at the point, the distance between xiphisternum and umbilicus is too big. My scope, I will have difficulty. Obviously, my scope will reach there, but we may have problem with the ergonomics. So my If I'm planning to do upper abdominal surgery, minimal access in this particular patient, somewhere my primary site, my primary trocar will be somewhere here. Similarly in thin patient. But you will see the relation of the umbilicus, what kind of surgery we want to do, how close or distant we are to umbilicus or so-called symphysis plexus. If the distance is very low, then again it's a problem of a space that needs to be understood. So do a nice pre-operative evaluation. Once that has been done, again in the OT, what you need to do is, okay, gastric contents, put a rice tube, empty them, especially when you are doing upper abdominal surgery. Lower abdominal surgery, especially if it is of short duration, catheter is not required. Just need to empty the bladder prior to surgery. But if the procedure is perhaps of a long duration, catheter is a must, especially for pelvic and gynae surgery. Okay, position the patient, and it's important when you are putting a primary access, patient should be essentially supine. Rest whenever the patient position can be changed, because if it is in a Trendelenburg or a reverse Trendelenburg, the bowel loops will be moving accordingly. So remember, the patient position for initial access is essentially supine, though it may change in some kind of other surgeries. You can again examine the abdomen, see the size, umbilical anatomy, laxity, that whatever the scar is there, you can just directly try to pinch it up. Obviously, any presence of mass also decides where your primary trocar shall be. If you are doing a large ovarian cyst and you are too close to the umbilicus, you may directly enter into the so-called cyst. You may be somewhere near, somewhere, have to be somewhere far from that particular mass. So see that laparoscopically. So there are a few techniques. I will start with the close technique because this was one of the first technique which was developed. Now this particular needle is a Veris needle. It was, I think, by a Hungarian person. His name was Jason Veris. Oh, I'm forgetting the name. Of course, Veris was his surname. This is popular by his name. Obviously, it was not designed for laparoscopic surgery. It was meant for tuberculous patients actually. So to collapse the lung and let the lung heal in the older times. Okay, but over a period, it was defined by, we know Palmer. Palmer was a great gynecological surgeon who was one of the initial pioneers of gynecological laparoscopically in a very early era. So he found its use for insufflation. Now this particular is a spring model. I believe everybody must have seen. Just a recap. It has a stellate and an outer sheath. Whenever you press it against the resistance, this particular inner sheath or the stellate goes in. And whenever there is loss of resistance, the spring-loaded mechanism, it comes out. This blunt tip comes out, so it gives you some kind of a protection so that this particular sheath doesn't pierce the organ beneath the abdominal wall. The procedure to put it is mostly held like a dart-like fashion. You have identified your area. Again, essentially it is an umbilicus. You have holded it with so-called tower clips, maybe with the hand. Some people prefer to lift the abdominal wall with the help of clips, and some do it with the hand. And the important thing is the direction. I think I will come on the next slide how it is to be inserted. But whenever it is inserted, you pierce through two walls. It has said to give you two definitive clicks, though it can vary. In some patients, if the wall thickness is too much, you may not. But yes, it is better appreciated than heard. There is lots of commotion in the OT. You may not hear what exactly the click is, but you feel it. I was talking about once you have decided for this close technique, it is very important to consider the direction. If the patient is having a normal BMI, do remember one thing is, in general anesthesia, especially under muscle relaxation, that this so-called distance here from the abdominal wall and this vertebral column, in front of it are major vessels. The distance is as small as 4 centimeters. That means whenever you're going in, there are high chance that you may injure the vessels. And this was the reason, this is the only thing which is associated with vascular injuries. Vascular injuries are very less common as compared to this in the open technique. So it has to be directed towards the pelvis. You see the distance here has been shown as almost 6 centimeters, with plus minus 3 depending. That minimum distance can be 3. If you are directing it straight in a thin patient, it's likely you may go into the major vessels. That needs to be understood. Patient is overweight or patient is obese. Overweight is then you are somewhere in between the position. The distance said to be 10 centimeters. So when the patient is thin, you are directing it toward the pelvis so that you may not hit the major vessels. The patient is obese, where obviously the abdominal wall is thin, so thick that 3 or 4 centimeters of the length of the Veress needle will be consumed by the Veress needle. So the chances of injury of so-called to the vascular major vessels are less. It is something like this. So whenever the patient is having a normal BMI or non-obese, you prefer it done in the oblique direction towards the pelvis, which is 45 degrees, or it is vertical in obese patients. There are many tests for confirmation when you do with a Veress needle. One is said to be a double click, then so-called hissing sound may not be appreciated. Hanging drop, put a drop here, lift the abdominal wall. If a drop goes inside because of negative pressure, you are perhaps in. You attach your needle, try to push some saline, it goes freely, you may be in the right plane, you aspirate, if nothing comes, you perhaps in the right plane, but blood or fecal matter may still come. Or you can just directly attach it to this thing and see what is the initial pressure. Pressure as low as 3 to 5 are said to be of intra-abdominal. But are these tests for sure? Actually, no test is actual confirmatory. Do remember that. No test is absolute 100% confirmatory. But one study has shown the most reliable method is intraperitoneal pressure measurement. We are talking of gasless. These are the problems with the gas. The closed technique is required when we are talking of gas. All these gadgets, all these tests, everything is required for the gas only. Now there's a tendency, some people may put the Veress needle in, it goes in like this and may try to see for free movement. That should not be done. If you are in the bowel, if you are in the vessel, that 1.6 mm hole may be converted into a larger one. Of course, when it is in position, you will attach it to the gas and put pneumoperitoneum. So I have put, I think, 10 slides of this. You can understand how many things are there when we do with the closed technique. And of course, after insufflation also, you have to again confirm you're in the right plane. That percuss, see for the abdominal wall elevation to be confirmed that you're in the right plane. But remember, having said all this about so-called closed technique, it is a two-step blind procedure. The first blind is you are putting a Veress needle. Second blind is when the so-called CO2 pneumoperitoneum is there, you're putting the trocar directly like this. It is a two blind steps in a Veress needle or a closed technique. So be wary of it. Veress needle doesn't come without a complication. If you are successful in first attempt, the complication is 0.8 to 16. But as your number of attempts increase, your success rate goes down tremendously and the complication comes up very high. Other access techniques, other alternative point, if you find a midline scar or scar somewhere here, you find umbilicus is not deemed for this thing, then other access can be a palmar point, which is 3 centimeters in mid-clavicle line below the costal margin. Prior to this technique, gastric decompression must, and of course, prerequisites are that no previous surgery should have been done in this. Open technique. Our Gill's technique is an open technique. I've given you the closed technique. Open technique initially was started by Hessens, and this was a cannula designed by him. It has an outer sheath, inner obturator, and this is a so-called conical stud devices where you fix the sutures. So in the open technique, what essentially you do is you make an incision in the skin, dissect out the subcutaneous fat, reach the linea alba. You can take sutures in the linea alba, or you can hold it with the Ellis forceps or a hemostatic forceps. Then you dissect it. You dissect it with a blunt instrument, something like a hemostat, which I'll be showing in the subsequent slides. And of course, once you think you are in, you put your finger in, you feel for the space, and then you fix this particular Hessens cannula, and then you start with carbon dioxide insufflation. The advantage of this is something more of a direct thing, that you see the peritoneal space, then you put the particular cannula. So there is no blind steps actually. This is a open technique. Our Gill's technique is also just an, you can say, modification or adaptation. In this, we can go at the umbilicus, we can go as per surgeon's choice, but essentially as with Dr. Ganraj, and what we do is we do a transumbilical thing. As sir has shown in the previous video, we are towards the lower part of the umbilicus. This is the upper part, this is the lower part of the umbilicus. We make a transumbilical incision extending 1 centimeter to infraumbilically. This is a vertical incision. Once the vertical incision is done, you see the linea alba or you see the umbilical cicatrix. You hold it with, you hold it with Ellis, and this is the Ellis forceps. You hold it with Ellis and evert it out, something like this. Just a slight eversion. No force should be light, just a slight eversion. Once that is done, and this is the Sir's technique. So what Sir does is, again I said infraumbilical vertical incision. Once he had dissected out the subcutaneous tissue, he takes a artery or this cautery and buzzes and makes a horizontal thing, horizontal cut, or you can show horizontal dissection with the help of this, only for the muscle and the linea alba. Once he is close to the peritoneum, and he uses a blunt instrument, something like this. This is an artery forceps, and of course the Sir has created this space like he was telling you with the help of S retractors. Now this, you can see how much space it is giving, the X retractor. But Ellis is a bit traumatic. It may not give you the desired space, but it is a good space when we see with a S retractor. So once you are in, you are confirmed that you are in with the help of a hemostatic forceps. Peritoneal cavity has been opened up. You put your finger inside to make sure that there is no adhesions or no part is stuck to the abdominal wall. Once you are confirmed that it has been done, there is no adhesion, you take the ring as shown in the video by Sir, and along with your finger, you start sliding it in a horizontal direction, just initially a bit vertical. Once the tip is inside, you turn the ring horizontal and rotate it. The ring goes into the abdominal wall. It is just beneath the anterior abdominal wall. And once the ring is in place, you again put your finger, sweep it around, see no bowel has been entrapped. Once this has been done, only then the lift is fixed and the abdominal wall is elevated. At MAMC, at our institute, we do a slight modification. Like I said, umbilical is a cicatrix. What we do is, after making an infraumbilical incision, we take regard of this umbilical cicatrix. We lift the umbilical cicatrix like this. In this picture, you can see we are using a Langerhans retractor. But essentially, the core essence is an open technique. Gill's technique, or the technique by Hessens, or a modification by us, the so-called MAMC technique, we take account of this umbilical cicatrix and we make a nick at the lower part of the cicatrix and where the linea alba is just starting. This particular point. We make the nick here, and we are, I said peritoneum is fused. The more closer you are to the umbilicus, the peritoneum is always fused, it's easy to get in. So once you make a nick, you again do a blunt dissection with the help of a hemostatic forceps. Open the peritoneum. If it is large enough, you can put a finger. But at our place, once we have identified the peritoneal cavity, we put the port and we confirm it by putting a scope. So that is our technique, a slight modification of another open technique. The other technique which is there in the books, just for your knowledge, is a so-called direct technique. But this technique, again, is a blind technique. There is no insufflation of the air. You take a trocar, it goes in directly through the abdominal wall. A fast technique, but least performed because it requires much of mastery. You should be aware of the abdominal wall, compliance, everything. You should be doing it. But in unprepared hands, inexperienced hands, the chances of injury is still can be more. So this is a so-called direct trocar entry, which can be done. But of course, when you do this, you connect it with the gas, insufflation, and do your other surgeries. So this is not our preferred method. What we do is, we are essentially in this so-called Gills lecture, the purpose is to tell you all techniques and give an emphasis on open techniques and the Gills technique. For your information, you must be aware there is something known as optical trocar, that is direct. You make an incision, and this particular port is there. You either insufflate, some people do not insufflate. You put a Veress needle, you have done insufflation, then you put your port telescope into this. This is a transparent tape. So while you are going inside into the port, into the telescope like this, by a rotatory movement, you see the various layers of the abdomen. Of course, you will never know when the bowel has come or when the thing has come if it is attached to the abdominal wall. So another, it is so-called partial blind steps. So Veress needle, 2 blind steps, direct trocar entry, 1 single blind step, optical trocar insertion, a partial blind step. So coming to my conclusion that I have been talking about these X6 techniques. So this summary is based on both techniques. So what we do here at our tertiary care institute or teaching practice, that we prefer teaching open technique first, and then we start gradually moving to closed technique. We want all our surgeons to be apt with both techniques. We start with open technique and slowly move on to closed technique, and we leave it to the surgeons, growing surgeons, that after a learning curve, they should choose what should they feel is most comfortable or easy for them to use as a, out of these so-called open techniques and the closed techniques. I hope I was able to finish up in time because I have one more topic which I will be covering up now. Any queries regarding this? Okay, so can we move? Can we take some queries?
Yes, sir. Anybody, if there are any questions, please feel free to shoot.
In the chat box.
In the chat box, there is a question about if there is an umbilical hernia, do you use a mesh or something like that, or just repair without a mesh?
Whenever there is an umbilical hernia, it always depends what kind of a surgery you are planning inside. When we do a surgery inside, essentially it is always a class 2 surgery. That means there is a possible contamination. Even you have opened a bowel, even you have opened a cystic duct, whether it is a clipped one, but a potential source of contamination is always there. So whenever you are doing all those surgeries, it's advisable only to do anatomical repair, no mesh.
Because we also generally don't use a mesh. But then do you have any literature on saying, I mean, any study comparing these two, use a mesh and without mesh? Because traditionally, till recently, we have not been using a mesh for these.
Like I said, it will always depend what the surgery you have been planning inside. If it is going to be a class 2 or class 3 kind of a thing, that kind of a wound, it's advisable not to put a mesh. Definitely, we do not have any high power study at present of comparing these post-surgery.
No, even if they're not doing any other surgeries, just a presence of umbilical hernia, do we have to use a mesh?
Oh,
like,
let me rephrase it.
Now
Okay.
it is for inguinal hernia, we definitely use a mesh always.
Okay. I will say there are multiple factors. As per the literature is concerned, it says any umbilical hernia more than 2 centimeters in defect shall be done with a mesh. So if the defect is less than that, you can do an anatomical repair. Plus, many more factors will come into play. Even if the defect is 1.5 centimeter, patient has some kind of a muscular defects, patient is a smoker, patient has already one other hernia, or he has some kind of liver disease, ascites is there. So if you have any of other comorbidities, the mesh should be to the jurisdiction of the surgeon. But as for the literature, 2 centimeters or more, mesh is required so far.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. If there are any questions, we will take them at the end of this next session. I'd ask Dr. Baines to please continue. Thank you, sir.
Let me just bring it. I have separated these two slides for ease of mind. So now my this second part, or this is of course the topic was having two parts. I will be talking about now about the pneumoperitoneum and about pathophysiology. More often, I will be again talking of increased intra-abdominal pressure and its consequences. So before I proceed, just think of this thing, abdomen. Abdomen is a closed cavity. Here is your diaphragm, the costal arches. Here is your bony pelvis and the organs supporting it. Then you have a retroperitoneum and a muscular anterior abdominal wall. So it is essentially a closed cavity. So pneumoperitoneum, the word itself says that is pneumo means gas in the peritoneal cavity. Essentially, the proper so-called terminology is carboperitoneum, because most of the time the gas which we are using is a carbon dioxide. So it essentially becomes carboperitoneum. Why carbon dioxide? Okay, it's very highly soluble. I am repeating many of the things you are aware of just to make a comprehensive talk. So highly soluble in the blood and tissues, high diffusion coefficient. It is a normal metabolic end product, no combustion. And if you see, gas symbolism is definitely there, but it is lowest among the all other gases. The gases which have been tried are air has been tried, simple air, atmospheric air, nitrogen, argon, helium. These gases have been tried with a limited success. So before I move on, when I keep on talking about pneumoperitoneum and its effects, I would like to consider what I'm going to talk about. All the effects are, I have divided it into two. One is mechanical. Mechanical, I mean to say, let us say this is a flaccid or a deflated football. And this is this like this. So once you start putting some gas or air into it, it becomes a takes a shape. But there is a range for that shape. If you keep on putting more and more air, you must have felt it is not resilient. It becomes some kind of a heart. That is what mechanical effect of a gas is there. Physiological, biological, or metabolic. This is when carbon dioxide is absorbed into the blood and body tissue and the consequences of that. So essentially we have two kinds of effect. And again, I was talking about that this is a small flaccid balloon. You put a gas, that children will enjoy the balloons, but it is when you put some amount of optimal air. If you keep on inflating it, it will start becoming tense, and beyond a point, it will rupture. Of course, abdominal wall is very resilient, very thick. It will not rupture. So what will happen? Whenever there is more gas, more pressure inside the abdomen, it will be started reflecting to the intra-abdominal organs. So the foremost system which takes all these effects of so-called pneumoperitoneum is cardiovascular system. Now, what are the two factors which are responsible? One is hypercarbia, that is carbon dioxide which is going inside is being absorbed by the peritoneal cavity into the blood, and it goes systemic, so there will be increased carbon dioxide in the blood, and if it is not excreted out, there can be acidosis. The body hemodynamics is working. If it is not out, ultimately will land up in acidosis, and you know the complications of acidosis. And other, of course, is an increased intra-abdominal pressure. The various effects on the cardiovascular system can be hypertension. Now, hypotension and bradycardia is one of the foremost. If you start doing rapid insufflation of gas somewhere around with more than 2 liters per minute, the first thing you notice is a bradycardia, and the patient BP start going down. The anesthesia will be just shouting on you, stop. You have to stop. So remove the gas out, wait for some time, only with anesthesia in concurrence, start insufflating with a low pressure. So it can be hypotension, it is not just bradycardia, it can be any kind of arrhythmia, and a late stage can be cardiac arrest. So hypercarbia, since it is highly soluble, increased peritoneal absorption and insufficient exhaustion, that is, it is being insufficiently excreted. You will be surprised to know that, I think as Okay, you will be surprised to know that almost 120 liters of so-called carbon dioxide can be there in the perineural cavity and in the dissolved form in the body. Up to that extent, it can be inside. You can think of deleterious effect of that. Other thing is hemodynamic effects it will cause because of a direct action of cardiovascular system and because of sympathetic system stimulation. So what this ultimately leads to? Decreased cardiac contractility. We know whenever there is acidosis, it causes direct suppression of myocardial contractility. And that is the reason when there is a persistent acidosis, heart starts filling in. Sensitization of the myocardial cells to the arrhythmogenic effects of the catecholamines, systemic vasodilatation. And when there is a systemic vasodilatation, BP crashes. So whenever there is an increase, now that was because of hypercarbia and acidosis, just think that increased intra-abdominal pressure, just like the balloon, what it will cause? This increased intra-abdominal pressure, there is an IVC going down, it will cause direct pressure on that IVC. That means venous return can be impaired. Obviously, preload will decrease and preload is required for cardiac output. If the less blood is going to the heart, there will be less cardiac output. And the arteries are pumping blood into the abdominal wall, abdominal cavity and other organs against a certain resistance of this intra-abdominal pressure. So there is increased systemic vascular resistance by virtue of increased pressure and by virtue of sympathetic activity. There can be increased pulmonary artery wedge pressure because the myocardium is already working in a closed chamber under some kind of a strain. In the respiratory system, so I will be talking of system one by one and other an issue which are there with the gas. So whenever there is a gas, the diaphragm goes up. When the diaphragm goes up, the lower part of the lung is compressed. This can cause compression atelectasis. Since there is a more pressure here, and this more pressure is being transmitted to the lungs, the peak inspiratory air pressure also increases. So that means the work of respiration is increased. However, all these surgeries with the pneumoperitoneum are being done with a general anesthesia. It is the anesthetist who is controlling the ventilation with the help of his veins circuit, the anesthetic circuit. So what is happening is this, ultimately the effect of pneumoperitoneum or increased intra-abdominal pressure will be a splinting of diaphragm. Diaphragm goes up and everything related to that. There is an increase in pulmonary compliance. It is not as early. Of course, because of the absorption, there can be hypercarbia and acidosis. There can be barotrauma because of the pressure, edemas, atelectasis. Atelectasis is one of the foremost thing with the increased intra-abdominal pressure. So I was saying 120 liters of carbon dioxide can be stored in the human body. Whenever you have used more carbon dioxide, think, and anesthesia people will definitely guide you that it is more inside the body, that you have to prolong ventilation. Patient will not be weaned out of the surgery unless carbon dioxide is eliminated nicely, or the ABG report, anesthetist has a good ABG report with him or her. Gastrointestinal function. So see, it is not just CVS, it is not just the respiratory system, it is causing effects on almost every organ. How in gastrointestinal system? Again, when there is a low cardiac output and increased resistance, the blood flow is a bit less. There is a decrease in so-called gut perfusion. As the pressure keeps on increasing, you do it more longer time, there can be some kind of a occult tissue ischemia. And the commonest organ which is susceptible is liver, is highly susceptible to this kind of increased intra-abdominal pressure, even to a pressure of 10. So I have written 20 mF of increased intra-abdominal pressure, mesenteric perfusion decreased by 40%. These studies have been validated in much of the animal models. In human, we do not have more of study, but yes, it has an effect on gastrointestinal function also. Renal function, again, the same thing. Renal blood flow is decreased because of the splenic circulation is decreased by a reduction in cardiac output. Increased resistance is there, and all these things are ultimately leading to a decreased perfusion of the kidney. Decreased perfusion of the kidney will lead to a decreased urine output. When there is a decreased urine output, renin-angiotensin will also be activated, in further addition to the intra-abdominal pressure. And of course, all this system will work to conserve water and electrolytes. So that whatever oliguria is being started with this, you have a compounded effect. So the most important change which happens in is a oliguria. KFTs don't derange. It is only when a high pressure is there in the abdominal cavity for a good amount of time. So what will happen? Creatinine, yes, it can be hampered, but the effect of creatinine change is seen after 2 or 3 days. So at a 15 mm of pressure inside the abdomen, the renal blood flow decreases by 28%, medullary blood flow decreases by 31%, GFR decreases to almost 30% of the normal range. But remember, these are transient changes. Whenever the body system is activated, this oliguria, so-called oliguria, is happening only in the initial half an hour or 1 hour, because we never use a pressure of 15 in so-called surgeries. We are using a pressure around 10 or 12. So this is almost reversible. A good amount of fluid channel anesthesia, anesthetic persons, anesthetists can take control of these things. Cerebral. I'm not aware that we wondered at my times when I was a junior agent, I was not aware that pneumoperitoneum can have cerebral effects also. So when the diaphragm is moving up because of the increased intra-abdominal pressure, the same pressure is imparted to the thoracic cavity. If it is imparted to the thoracic cavity, jugular vein, which has no valves, the pressure is extended along to the JVP, and ultimately is venous return is decreasing. So what will happen? If you remember Monro-Kelly doctrine for the brain, that all three things, blood, CSF, and brain tissue remain in equilibrium. If one thing increases, the other thing decreases at the expense. So cerebral blood flow decreases and intracerebral pressure increases. Any organ system left that I should talk about? Almost everything. On the peripheral perfusion, yeah. I'm there. I will take up the question. You can put up in the chat box for the meanwhile, and I will just finish up this thing. We'll come to the questions. Peripheral perfusion, like I said, football has been there. Abdominal cavity is football. The pressure is more. This pressure is also being extended to the femoral veins. And there can be reduced blood flow up to the extent of 60%. Of course, it varies with how much amount of pressure is there. So if the venous blood flow is decreased, there is some kind of a stasis in the veins, there can be increased likelihood of DVT. So when say a decade back, when pneumoperitoneum was happening, plenty of study came which suggested, yes, D-dimer and other FDG products do increase in some patients in prolonged surgeries, but they were not enough to cause DVT. But yes, the effect was seen. So virtually, if you see almost every organ, the essential organ, cardiovascular system, the abdominal cavity organs, stomach, liver, brain, lungs, kidney, all major organs are being affected because of an increased intra-abdominal pressure because of the pneumoperitoneum. This time I have added just for you to just remind, if there is a sustained increase in pressure, or there is an unchecked rise in intra-abdominal pressure, it can give rise to multi-organ failure. It is something like this. Increased intra-abdominal pressure. Now, there is a society. Now, they have found that increased intra-abdominal pressure to the tune of more than 10 up to 20 for a longer period of time can be a trigger for multi-organ dysfunction. So it is just like the dominoes here, which I placed, that with one fall, others start falling. Increased pressure, one system falls, another system falls, and ultimately, if no timely intervention is done, there can be disastrous effects to the patients. Just to intra-abdominal hypertension, I just put a couple of slides. This is my another favorite topic. That's why I put. You can see if the pressure remains in the range of 0 to 10, the organ system is 100% working. So till 15 or 20, the organ system is here. Decline starts in organ function almost at 20, and over as the pressure keeps on increasing, the organ system continues to fall. This is what I was talking about, how the intra-abdominal pressure or hypertension has its effects. Again, this increased interruption 12 to 15, there is increased physiological compromise, but body can take care of it. focal dyspnea at this pressure, and intra-abdominal hypertension or abdominal compartment system if it is more than 20. So having said that, what I have been talking about increased effects, you can see how many things are there. How many organ systems? Virtually every organ system of the body is being affected by increased intra-abdominal pressure or by hypercarbia or the acidosis. But do remember, over the period, the things have evolved. That is why how we have come that a pressure of 10 to 12 millimeter of mercury should be used for surgeries with gas, with pneumoperitoneum. Okay. And of course, the anesthetic is there to control the ventilation, to drive the extra CO2 out. But these are the deleterious effects on the various organs. There are some more effects. Hypothermia. The gas which is coming, and to the majority of settings, we also still do not have a humidifier system with us. So the gas at the temperature in the cylinder or so-called is almost at 20. That 20 and the body core temperature is around 37. So difference of almost 15 and 17 degrees. This particular gas is going into the abdomen directly and also by convection. So ultimately what is a cold gas, and by convection effects, it can, and you are directly inside the core of the body, abdominal cavity. Then can be hypothermia for a long-standing surgery if the gas is not conditioned. Plus, whenever there is general anesthesia, you see the anesthetists are very fond of putting blankets if the patient is uncovered because GA causes some kind of a thermal instability. Patients are not able to maintain their core temperature under the GA. Desiccation of peritoneum. Now the cold gas is coming in. This particular dry gas which is here, and these are the mesothelial cells of the peritoneum. Now there can be desiccation of these cells. This is the normal one and this is the desiccation. So what this desiccation is causing? Usually the mesothelium is one of the very early regenerating. Within 24 to 48 hours, the layer is replaced. But if there is a good amount of this particular loss, desiccation, it can lead to some kind of adhesion formations. Now again, this has been validated in many of the animal studies. In human studies, the study have been limited. We do not have a conclusive evidence, but yes, desiccation of peritoneum can happen with so-called carbon dioxide gas or pneumoperitoneum. Now this is how the pneumoperitoneum induced mesothelium damages. Now this is integrated. This is how the cells are so-called disrupted. And if you use a normal gas, the disruption is so-called minimal. This is a microscopic image just to highlight how the things are. Then there are fogging issues. The gas is there, the gas is cold. Your perhaps OT temperature may be normal temperature. So whenever there is a difference in temperature, there can be a dew point and the telescope can become something like this. So if it becomes something like this, I cannot view. So there are fogging issues with the gas. Gas embolism, that is a gas bubble in the vessels. Now it is a very, very rare complication. May happen most of the time, which has been documented. It has been documented that whenever the close technique was used, the needle has gone directly into the major vessel and insufflation was done. Because a good amount of gas is required to kill a patient. So it is a rare complication. Yes, it can happen with a gas. So you can see the gas has reached here. Now the gas will lock here itself and it will be an impediment to the gas cardiac output. That is how it kills. So gas embolism can be there. Subcutaneous emphysema. So if the peritoneal breach is there or you are doing extraperitoneal surgeries, yes, the gas can go into subcutaneous tissue. Now it can go during the surgery. It can go at the start of surgery. If your trocar is not in the right plane, yes, some amount of gas can leak. You can definitely feel the crepitus. So this is how a gas subcutaneous emphysema looks like. This is a gas or air in the testes. Whenever we do this TEP or TEPP procedure and the section has been extended there, some amount of gas can be seen in the scrotum also. That is a very usual phenomena. The gas usually get absorbed by 24 to 48 hours if it is not excluded out. It's not released out. Pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum, again rare complication. So especially when we are working in the near the hiatus or in fundoplication or at upper retroperitoneal surgeries, something like this, you can have, and the gas seeps into and can cause pneumothorax. Now, what are the aftermaths of pneumothorax? Everyone is aware of. You have to put a tube on the table only. The gas can, from this hiatal dissection, can go into the mediastinum. You can see the air as a black being shown here. So these are possible rare complications with the gas. Loss of space, very important. If you are doing a laparoscopic surgery, minimal access surgery, you find so much amount of blood in the field, some vessel has been opened, some vein has been taken care of. So you know what the danger of there when you do with the gas immediately. So this is a so-called spurter. This is a spurter here from coming. The first reaction is to clear the field. To clear the field, you put in a suction device. The moment you do suction, the gas is sucked out. You're not able to see anything. So one of the damage has been started with the so-called bleeding. The other damage is done when you don't see anything and you try to buzz a thing or try to fire a thing, some staple or some ligature to control the bleeding. So it can potentiate. Now these issues are not there with the gasless. You can put even a bigger suction. You can put a gauge piece directly, compression. So there are no hassles with the gas that you have to turn it off, you have to enlarge, you have to see. Here everything is under your control. You can put a gauge piece directly in the designated quadrant. You put a large bore suction. So the gas is not a problem. It is being held by the left. No loss of space issues. So virtually increased intra-abdominal pressure and hypercarbia and acidosis, you think, is affecting almost all the major organs. Not even almost, is affecting all the organs of the body. So to conclude that pneumoperitoneum has significant side effects, complication, and the problems, all of these pneumoperitoneum related issues can be overcome with a gasless lift laparoscopy, and you should be good enough to choose your Gill's cases judiciously. Okay, this is, I couldn't find a better picture, but just to thank you, Dr. Dhanraj. This is after our RC when we were doing a cadaveric dissection. This is the lift and this is the device we are just with our trainees. So this is the elevation will always remain and there will be no loss of space when we have a lift device in place. Okay, that's it. I can take up the questions now. I have tried to cover the previews or brief but comprehensive about various XX techniques and the pathophysiology of pneumoperitoneum.
Thanks, Dr. Lovinesh. Actually, if you've been listening for the last 1 hour, you might wonder why do you ever do a regular laparoscopic surgeries. One other thing you need to remember is that these are not very common. And especially if the surgery finishes within 1 hour or 1.5 hours or 2 hours, we hardly see any of these complications. That is the reason why everybody keeps continuing to do traditional laparoscopic surgeries.
Yes, yes. Agreed. So coming up to this, so now you have understood the ill effects of so-called pneumoperitoneum with the gas. You have also, I given you how much difficulty is in the learning phase with the closed technique. So gasless, our Gill's is there. It will overtake all of these complications. So it's high time that yes, everyone gets used to it, start using it. We need more and more people to do. We need to have enough of data of more of gasless things to further substantiate our claim on a more bigger global platform.
Again, when traditional laparoscopic surgeries started,
yes, sir,
people started evaluating all these complications and physiological changes and so on. And that is the reason why gasless laparoscopy also started almost simultaneously in the 90s.
Yes.
But again, the problem you need to realize is that with the gasless, initial apparatus, the vision was not as clear or as good as traditional laparoscopic surgeries. And that is one of the reasons why they didn't pursue that.
Definitely. Yeah, sir has given you his video. And so earlier devices were cumbersome. They were cumbersome, like there were some wires going through the abdominal cavity, and that was used to lift. And there was some kind of a planar device that one, it goes into this plane like that, this plane. So cumbersome devices were there. Now with the modification, Dr. Ganaraj, with the LaproLift, you see the ring device, whatever elevation we get is a wonderful elevation. It is comparable to the pneumoperiton, with the gas.
And the other advantage with the gasless is that if you're using ports, you can use the very old ones which are leaky and which are not really good. Disposable ones can be reused many times. See, one other problem that visitors to the rural hospitals had was that whenever we are using pneumoperitoneum, the abdominal pressure never rises about 8 or 9.
Yes.
And people who are used to operating at the pressures of 10 to 12 will find it difficult to operate with the lower pressures.
Yes.
But again, now with the COVID situation, the current recommendation is that you keep the pressures low at 8, which means that the vision and adequacy probably may be even better with gasless than with the lower pressures.
Absolutely. We should just come up with our data in the studies that COVID is whatever that we have a minimal contamination, the so-called aerosol generation, and which is under pressure, which is not there in this. It is not there in this.
So we do have an advantage because of the current situation also to do a gasless.
We are working in a designated COVID hospital. You know, our hospital has been converted into 1,500 now, being pushed for 2,000 bed COVID hospital only. So we better know.
So no operating now.
Yes.
What about the friends from Kenya and Africa? Any questions from them? Probably they are overwhelmed by the too much of theory. But basic thing is to remember that when you have the gases, it causes a lot of problems. One, because the mechanical pressures, the physiological changes because of use of carbon dioxide. And once some problem starts, it's like a domino effect. It keeps shifting to more and more systems. And the longer you take for operating or any complications occur, then the traditional laparoscopy becomes more and more difficult. And that's why the advantage of gasless is there, because you can use the regular open method that developed over 200, 300 years. We can apply pressure, we can use the larger suctions and so on. And we don't really bother to many. Another problem could be that if you use a higher pressure and there's no bleeding, once pressure is released, then it can start oozing and bleeding. That also is not there when you use gasless. So there are a lot of advantages of gasless, but then it needs to be judicially used and we need to learn how to do it. And one difference probably which makes gasless a little more difficult is that, especially when you're putting the additional ports, there's not much of a counter pressure. Like if there's a traditional laparoscopy, the gas pushes the abdominal wall and you can poke the additional ports in. So here you need to give counter traction from instrument inside or cut all the way before you insert the thing. There are a few smaller changes that you need to adapt. Otherwise, it's a good technique for rural areas. I think there's one question in the chat. Okay. Thanks to Lovinesh. We gone a little more than the usual time. So if no questions are there, then we can.
So see, one topic is very close to me, abdominal compartment syndrome. I've already done a study on, so that's why I put it in. So that is why it got extended. So one was essentially more of theory. The video you have already shown how to go inside this thing just for the start of that. So I think there was no point in showing the video again. Fine, sir.
Yeah, thank you then.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lovinesh Bains.
Thank you, Keso. Take care. Everyone
take care.
Bye.
Bye.